The Wagner's been around since 1855, and our mission is double. It's to teach contemporary science to the public and also to interpret and preserve the Wagner's historic building, which you can sort of glimpse in the background of my, where I am. It's a time capsule of 19th century science. So this Weeknights at the Wagner series is just one of many programs that we offer, but all of our programs, because it's in our mission, are free of charge with the goal of making them truly accessible to everyone. So we've been closed as a building during the pandemic, but it's a national landmark with a museum, a library, and a historic lecture hall where most of these programs normally take place. While we've been closed, we're doing all of our courses, lectures, science lessons, and even museum tours for, and offering them so people can do them from home. So this Weeknights at the Wagner series has been running more or less bi-weekly on Wednesdays, each time with a different speaker. If you're interested in staying connected and tuning in 2021, sign up for a newsletter or follow us on Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter. So that's the end of our announcements. I'm really delighted to welcome Maggie Cernick. She's a historian of medicine, the environment, and children's history. Great combination. She has her PhD in history and sociology of science from the University of Pennsylvania, and she teaches both at Penn and at Columbia University. She's finishing a book, Nature's Cure, American Families at the Beach, 1870 to 1930, which explores nature prescriptions and medical and health-seeking practices that are right on the subject of tonight's talk. And lastly, a plug for the Wagner. Like everything we do, this program is free, and it's our mission to make things free, but we do need support. We just launched our annual appeal as part of Giving Tuesday that'll run obviously through the month and the end of the year. We have a very ambitious goal to help us get into 2021 and continue to offer our programs. And we have an extraordinary matching gift of $20,000. So every gift made to that appeal will be doubled. Many people contributed to yesterday's Giving Tuesday, and that was thrilling. And we thank you if you have, and hope if you like tonight's talk, you might also be inspired to contribute. And what we do is not possible without individual support. So now on to Maggie. Thank you.
Thanks, Susan. I appreciate it. Well, thank you all so much for spending part of your evening with me. I'm really delighted to be here. And I thought what we would do just to start the conversation, and I really do hope this will become a conversation tonight, is to think about where it is you go on vacation, right? This has been such an exceptional year. There was so much angst over the summer about like, should we travel? Can we travel? Where can we go? Where can we not go? What's safe? What isn't safe? And so I thought it might be fun to think about just sort of collectively, where do you go on vacation, or where would you love to go on vacation and why? And I would love to either feel free to unmute and chime in or put it in the chat. I have my chat box up so I can see, but I'm really curious to sort of see collectively where people tend to go when you do travel.
Somebody said the beach.
The beach.
Put it in chat.
Island beaches. Okay, any specific island beaches? Summer in Wildwood. We were just talking about the Jersey Shore and how different towns tend to go to different places. The Caribbean, Brigantine. All right, lots of Jersey Shore. I'm loving this. Oh, a lake in the Adirondacks. Not a beach person. Okay, the Adirondacks is great. Ocean City, Florida, mountains on a lake. Outer Banks. Susan was just talking about the Outer Banks as well. Warm scenic locations. That sounds lovely right now that we're getting a little colder. Oh, cool. Okay. The forest and the Pine Barrens. That's wonderful. So this is great, right? And feel free to like keep them coming in. I think one of the things that's really fascinating about this is that, national parks. We are also a national park family. We, fingers crossed, are going to be going out west. We did Yellowstone 2 summers ago, and we're hoping to go through the Dakotas this time. But I think one of the things that's really interesting about this is that if you look at the trends here, right, there's a couple things, lots of beach locations, lots of shore locations, which I guess I shouldn't be surprised because maybe that's why you guys are coming here tonight. But you're also seeing the forest, and the Pine Barrens in particular is really interesting, and the mountains. All of those locations are very, very, very much based in sort of historical trends about why we travel and where we're traveling to. You'll notice, okay, we have somebody say, "Ooh, retrace Lewis and Clark. That's really cool." And as a child, summer in Ventnor. Okay. One of the things that's really interesting that you'll notice is what's not here, right? Not a single person yet has put in cities. Okay. That is very much in keeping with the ways in which sort of tourism developed in the United States. One of the primary sort of motivating factors that really drove a lot of the sort of rise of tourism, especially among the middle class, was this idea that people really needed to escape the city, right? And you needed to escape the city for all sorts of reasons, but really most importantly, for health. So that's really sort of like what we're focusing on today. And as the title suggests, we're going to be focusing on the beach. Now, the mountains has its really interesting own sort of history, as do the Pine Barrens. There was actually a lot of literature about how the smell of pine, the coniferous smell, was actually intrinsically healthy for you. So each of these are very sort of part and parcel of the ways in which people would have been sort of traveling to sort of escape what the city was. And we can certainly talk about like ideas about what made the city an unhealthy space. They were very people, physicians, public health officials, mothers, children, like everybody sort of just collectively knew the cities were dangerous. And we can talk about that. It's not going to be the focus of today. So here's just a brief outline of what I'm going to be talking about. I'm going to give you a little bit of a background on my research. This is really just such a small snippet of what I study. But I am going to ground it, given the fact that this is a Philadelphia sort of institution, as well as it seems like a lot of people are maybe sort of like local. I'm going to be focusing a lot on Atlantic City as using those as kind of examples, and especially an institution called the Chilton Seashore House. And I don't know if somebody's familiar with the Chilton Seashore House today. If you go down to sort of the Penn Medical area and you actually walk down the street just past CHOP, you'll see a building and that's about 3 stories high, and across the top of it, it says the Children's Seashore House. Okay, that's not the Children's Seashore House that I study. I'll talk about the one that I have been sort of looking at, but that is the sort of contemporary version of it. And I'm going to really sort of specifically drill down into the sort of like the medical knowledge that was produced about the seashore that really allowed it to become this space of health and healing in sort of Americans' minds, and really helped to drive the association with going to the seashore as a sort of specifically healthy and beneficial place. And then at the end, we'll sort of talk a little bit about the legacy, both of the institutions as well as these kind of ideas. Okay, so background. A little bit of background about my project. I lived in Boston. Before I lived in Philly, I lived in Boston for about 10 years. And I knew the Boston Floating Hospital. I knew it as an institution that looks like this image on your left. Very large, modern medical building. You see this like big FAO Schwartz type of bear out in front of it. You can see where it's located in the map on your right. It's right in the middle of the city. So it's actually sort of near Chinatown in the Theater District. And it's very much an urban institution. And I frankly sort of like often thought it was like a sort of a strange name, like the Boston Floating Hospital. And being in my 20s and not actually really ever having an opportunity to go there, I thought it was probably metaphorical. I thought maybe they had a lot of mobile clinics or something of that nature. And I just frankly, beyond that, didn't give it a lot of thought until I went to graduate school. And in graduate school, I was working on a research paper that was about another sort of children's health topic. And as I was doing research on that, I came across a picture that looked like this. And it was literally one of those like the emoji like head slapping ones where I was like, oh, of course, like it was a floating hospital because it was a boat. And I just became like so tickled by this idea that there were these floating hospitals. And I started to look into them. And it turns out Boston was not the only city to have a floating hospital. New York had a floating hospital, and they actually it was maintained on a ship until September 11th, 2001, after which time they were no longer able to secure dock space for it. I started looking into this. I was sort of really curious, like, why was this founded? Who was going there? You know, all these kinds of questions. So I went from Philadelphia back up to do research in Boston, and went to the archives at the Boston Floating Hospital and found some of these images. So the image, I know it's very grainy on the left-hand side, but that is actually one of the levels of the ship. And so you can see lots of cribs all nestled together on the inside with children inside. Those would be their mothers standing next to them. So the Boston Floating Hospital would invite mothers and children to come, and it was a day trip. So they would pick them up at the dock in the morning, they would sail them around the bay, and so that they can enjoy the sort of like moving sea air off of the bay. They actually had basins where mothers would be taught how to properly bathe their babies, where they would actually pump up the water from the Boston's bay, which if you think about industry at the like late 19th, early 20th century, sounds a little disgusting actually. But they would bathe the babies there. And they would also, for little kids who like had very sort of different conditions, they would actually strip the babies down, put them up on the sun deck so that they could sort of absorb the sun rays. And that's the picture on the right-hand side. And you can notice that some of the little children's legs are bowed. That would be because some of these children had rickets, which was a condition of vitamin D deficiency, which wasn't known at the time to be that. So I was doing this research. I was staying with my college roommate at the time. She had a young son who was about 3 years old. And when I came home from doing all this research, he climbed into my lap and he's like, "Where were you today?" And I was like, "I was at a library." And he was like, "Well, what were you reading?" And I thankfully like photocopied one of the pamphlets that was about the foundation of the Boston Floating Hospital. So I sort of sat down and I flipped through it and I was like showing him these pictures. And his eyes just got really big. And he looked at me, he's like, "Why are there babies on a boat?" And I started laughing because that was my research question, and a 3-year-old had just defined it. But I think it was a really important question, right? Because like, why is it? Why were they putting babies and mothers on boats? And as I started sort of like looking into this phenomenon, one of the things I quickly discovered is that these were far from unique institutions. They were very closely related to seashore hospitals. And there was the seashore hospital that you see on the right-hand side is the Children's Seashore House in Atlantic City, New Jersey. The structures that you see on the left-hand side that look like tents, that was Seabreeze Hospital, which was located in Coney Island, New York. Those were the original sort of structures. They were temporary. They eventually became a hospital that was like an actual sort of foundation of a hospital. And as it turns out, seashore hospitals were found all over the sort of in the northeastern corridor, and you'll notice also outside of Chicago. They were also found in almost every Western European country, and there were 2 in Argentina outside of Buenos Aires. So these were really prominent institutions. And as you'll notice from where the stars are, you can see that these are all localized very tightly right next to major urban centers. And sure enough, that's what these were a response to, is they were a response to the conditions that were intrinsic to urban life. And you saw people sort of like really lament the fact that people, and as children especially, were being raised in these unnatural urban settings where they were very, living in very densely packed environments with lots of people, with very little sanitation. There would often, if you've been to the Tenement Museum in New York City, right, you sort of have a sense that like sometimes there would be like 6, 7, 8 people in one room that would have no windows, no ventilation, no sunlight. And this was really concerning to people because they were very much tying that to the diseases that they were seeing that were very common to this time period. So it brings me to then these seashore hospitals. And this is really where I want to sort of spend part of the majority really of my talk tonight, is really sort of looking at like, what are these institutions and what did they represent? because we're going to be focusing mostly on the Children's Seashore House, what I'm also interested in, and please, again, feel free to sort of type in your answers in the chat. I'm interested to hear what you think about today when you hear Atlantic City. What are your associations of Atlantic City? Casinos. Yep.
Boardwalk.
What was that, Jeffrey?
Boardwalk.
Okay. Yeah, the boardwalk. Yep. Gambling, the Steel Pier, Miss America. Yes. Right. And Salt Air. Oh, awesome. I love that. Salt Air. Donald Trump. Yep. Uh-huh. The beach scene, grand hotels of yore. Right. When I first started doing this research, there was the TV shows and like movies coming out about it, right? Boardwalk Empire was all the rage. Saltwater Taffy Monopoly. I love this. The Easter Parade. Yeah. So a lot of these, right? It has this kind of entertainment aspect to it, right? That there is a lot of like sort of like glitz and glamour. There is a little bit of the beach, obviously, right? It is Atlantic City. And if you go on and you start looking up pictures of what Atlantic City is today, right? This actually captures a lot of what you guys said. You've got the casinos, you've got the gambling, you've got Trump's Taj Mahal there front and center. And I didn't sort of plant that as just the first one that came up. You certainly also have the boardwalk. Atlantic City had the first boardwalk in the United States. And one of the reasons that they first institutionalized that, it was a way that hotels could avoid getting so much sand in their lobbies. But it also served as a promenade so that people could walk along the beach and get the benefits of that sort of sea air. Right, some of you mentioned beach scenes, right? So yes, there is a beach. One of the first times that I went down to Atlantic City to actually start studying the Children's Seashore House, somebody bet me that I couldn't find a way to get to the beach. And I was like, yeah, it's actually trickier than you might think, like when you're really in the thick of it. And you have all of the outlets and, you know, all these other casinos that are sort of like right there along the sort of the beach frontage. Now, this is really what it would have looked like, though, about 100 years ago. And I think this is really sort of interesting, right? Because it captures some of that sort of the entertainment. It is still built up. You have a lot of the grand hotels, and these really were grand hotels. But before there was this, Atlantic City was actually known as the City of Cottages. And it had this very sort of like small, familial, more intimate sense. But a lot of it was still very, very much focused on the beach itself. And this was deliberate. Before the 1850s, Atlantic City as we know it and as people knew it about 100 years ago simply didn't exist. It was essentially, there was some people, there were natives who lived there. There were people who were fishermen who lived there. And there were very, very, very few other inhabitants. And in the 1850s, a physician named Jonathan Pitney was said in the sort of like story that gets told about it is he was sort of looking for a place where sort of weary, rundown urban residents could go. And he's kind of looking at this map and like sees that like exactly like straight across from Philadelphia is the sort of island that is Atlantic City now. And he went there and investigated it. And what he said he found was this amazing environment. And as he and others would then go to describe it, that this place was so sort of pure and so untouched, which is a very sort of common narrative we tell in American history. But that in contrast to the cities from which he was coming and others were coming, it was this kind of pristine, untouched, natural environment. And he decides to found Atlantic City and build a railroad and fund a railroad to go straight from Philadelphia through New Jersey, through the Pine Barrens, and to Atlantic City. And that's what he does. And the way he sells it to Philadelphia residents is that this is this space of health and this space of healing. And other people really quickly sort of buy into that. Oh yeah, so great question. So the question is, was the 1850s that coincide with Kellogg and other wellness movements? It really, really did. And so some of those wellness movements, this was a time of like a really large medical marketplace in the United States. So you had a lot of alternative healers, and as well as they were sort of competing with some of the more elite medical practitioners. But at the time, I think it's important to recognize that physicians in the United States in the mid 19th century really did not have much status and stature. They were considered a really lowly profession. There are these like amazing quotes where people are like, basically, if you fail at everything else, like you go to college, you cannot get a job in any other field, at least you can still become a physician, right? So this was a moment where like the sort of AMA is founded in 1847, and they are trying to sort of establish themselves as a more elite function. But yes, this really did sort of have a sort of larger sense of what was going on. And so there's another question is, did people recognize that mental health as a concern? Yes. So, it was also sanitary. So yes, you guys are asking all the right questions already. I love it. One of the things that people really celebrated, and physicians were celebrating, is that they would tell people like, you should leave the urban centers, which we know drain your sort of vital energy. They were very concerned with that. They would talk about sort of like the brain work and the brain worry that was really sort of draining your physical energy because of urban life and the work you were doing there. And what you needed to do was you needed to escape, and you needed to go to this other place where all of that sort of energy could be restored. But it was also really grounded in the physical environment and the physical landscape, right? And they would talk about these sort of wonderfully curative powers, this is a quote, the dry, bracing atmosphere, the cool, delightful breezes that floated over its surface, and the unsurpassed bathing facilities it presented in the long lines of crested waves that fell and dashed into foam on its gently sloping and silvery sanded beaches, right? So that was a description of what Atlantic City would have to offer. And physicians would actually sort of write prescriptions, and they would tell their patients, like, you need to get out of the city and go to Atlantic City. And they would report that the patients who they would send there would come back completely transformed. And one physician wrote that Atlantic City's climate, quote, affords relief and cures to all rheumatic fever and arthritis, even in the most acute stages. And that many cases in which invalids, after having recourse without benefit to various mineral waters and baths in the country, have there been entirely cured by a summer sojourn, right? So this idea, right, your question about like, was this coinciding with Kellogg and these other health movements? Yes, right? That physician was rhetorically placing sort of sea bathing practices with other water cure movements. And you would see pictures like this, right? You would just see these amazing images of throngs of people sort of like wading into the ocean, standing around on the beach, hanging out, right? And so this really sort of resonated as a practice. And as the railroad opened up, it opened up access to far more people, right? This was a very remote location when it first opened up. A second railroad opened up, of course, then you get competition, prices go down, more people are able to go. So one of the things I really want to sort of mention here is that as people were going, you can imagine these throngs of people who are on this beach that you can see here. One of the reasons they're going is to partake in the sea bathing, the sea air, the sunshine. They're also there as tourists. And one of the places that they would actually go as tourists was to the Children's Seashore House. So visitors who would be traveling from Philadelphia, and actually visitors who would go to Atlantic City from all over the world, would actually make it a point to go to the Children's Seashore House and witness children sea bathing, sunbathing, playing on the beach. And I think it's really important because it indicates the ways in which this sort of hospitals operated as this visible space where people could see the healthful practices that were being contained within this medical institution. And it kind of reaffirmed the things that they had been doing all day as being really healthful, right? And you can think about like, that's such an American thing in some ways, right? We have, and historically always have had this tension with taking vacations and going on, like taking a break, right? In this way that you're sort of like, well, why are, like, shouldn't we be working? And you have that sort of tension. You can sort of see it playing out, right? Which is like very sort of like Puritan work ethic, or the Protestant work ethic rather, right? And you see that people are sort of like rationalizing in this way of like, oh, okay, what I'm doing is I'm actually shoring up my health so that I can return restored. And they're watching mothers and children actually partaking in that, and they're witnessing it in action. So one of the things, just a quick background. One of the questions, was there a spa with waters to drink like in Bath, England or Saratoga Springs? There wasn't, okay? They were not actually drinking the water, which was good because salt water is really bad for you. But they did have bathhouses that actually lined the boardwalks. And the bathhouse was originally established for convalescent patients. So they knew, like Atlantic City knew and built up its identity very deliberately as a place for sick and rundown and weary residents to go. And so the proprietor who established the bathhouse did it with the idea of like, if you're too weak to go into the ocean, you can come to the bathhouse instead. And that therefore it's like not as rough and it's not as cold. I'll even warm it up for you. And what quickly happened is tourists were like, well, that sounds better, right? So they started going. So really like, it was not so much a space of convalescence as it was for sort of just like a more pleasurable bathing experience, but it did not have a spring. Now within the Children's Seashore House, one of the things that really intrigued me as a historian of medicine is that these institutions just make no sense. They were founded in this one was founded in 1872. It was actually the 4th children's hospital in the United States of America. It was admitting mothers and children, and mothers and children were actually seeking admission to this hospital. And that's really weird. What most historians of medicine have documented is that around this time period, people would avoid going to hospitals at all costs. They were institutions of last resort. It is where people who had no friends and no family and no other options would go to be taken care of. What was also known is that parents really tried to avoid sending their children to children's hospitals. So CHOP had already been established. There was a couple of others, but families really feared sending their children to hospitals because hospitals often had very, very restrictive visiting policies, with the idea that parents, as mothers especially, were the reason their children were sick. So parents would not be allowed to visit either at all, or maybe for like 1 hour during the day, which was oftentimes that like parents would have to work. So there was a lot of fear about sort of sending your child someplace and not being able to see them, or worse, having them be experimented on, which people knew was going on and in fact was happening. Right? So there was a lot of fear around most institutions, and yet here you have these seashore hospitals where like mothers are clamoring to go there. They had wait lists. Some seasons they didn't even get through the entire wait lists. And so I was trying, part of what my research was doing, so I was trying to figure out like why? Like, why are these institutions so popular? What was going on? And I'm happy to talk about that in the Q&A a little bit more. But in addition to having mothers and children there, these were deliberately founded as institutions that admitted patients without regard to race, religion, nationality, ability to pay, or anything else. And you can see from the picture in the bottom right-hand side of the screen, this is a picture from the Children's Seashore House. The woman on the left is one of the nurses. She's sitting with the patients, and you can see that this is an interracial group of patients that was being admitted there. It was certainly not proportionate to the overall population. The majority of patients seemed to be sort of mostly of Italian background who ended up going there. But one of the things that they really had in common was they were almost always from a working class background. And they were almost always, this was seen and understood to be a Philadelphia institution. Children who would come there with a wild range of diseases and conditions. I'm only going to read you the beginning of this list because it's so long. But in 1910, children were admitted with abrasions of the head, hand, and knee, abscesses, adenitis, adenoids, amputation, anemia, arthritis, asthma, appendicitis, burns, bronchitis, bronchopneumonia, cholera infantum, chorea, congenital dislocation of the hip, conjunctivitis, contusions, cretinism, convalescence, debility, dentition, dysentery, dysmenorrhea, diphtheria, eczema, endocarditis. The list keeps going on and on and on, right? I only got to the E's, right? But it was sort of seen as this like panacea. And a lot of the seashore hospitals that would open would sort of specialize, especially over the winter months, in the treatment of cases of tuberculosis. These were places that were known to be able to sort of treat and potentially even cure diseases that were almost impossible to treat in urban centers. And this is fascinating to me because this was at the very moment that these institutions proliferated internationally, was the same time that germ theory was displacing older environmental ideas and ideologies about disease causation. So while you have that sort of those ideas kind of like moving over to the side, and germ theory really sort of rising and taking its place in this sort of larger understanding that it really is these like discrete bacteria and other microorganisms that are causing disease, you have this rise of an environmentally based therapeutic program. And so what I was trying to think about is why, right? Why were physicians and nurses supporting what one physician called marine medication? And really, this is where sort of I'm bridging into those like three main areas, right? So looking at what was the program that they were institutionalizing, and how were they justifying it, right? What were they actually believing? Now I mentioned that like, although some physicians were aligning with these like larger practices of things like water cure movements, these were really central institutions. These were being run by some of the most elite members of the medical establishment of their time. The person who ran the Children's Seashore House was a gentleman named Dr. William Bennett. He was there from 1874 until his death in 1919. And he not only trained at the University of Pennsylvania, which was the premier medical school at that time in the United States, he then went to Austria and trained in childhood diseases, so like the precursor to pediatrics. So he was at the top, right? He was at the very top of his profession. So these weren't these kind of like quack, crazy institutions that everyone's like, what's happening? These were really central. And people were publishing about these practices, including sort of seawater bathing, in the top medical journals of the day. Now, we sort of think about like, what do we think about? Like when we think about going to the beach with like children, right? Maybe parents tell their kids like, don't go swimming until like 30 minutes after you eat, right? There are those kind of admonitions, but you think about children just spending their days like running through the water, in the ocean, sitting in the waves. That's not what was occurring at the seashore hospitals. Rather, what was happening, you sort of see this, it looks like, maybe they're not doing very much in this picture. You see the one boy over to the right-hand side who was like waiting in on his crutches. This is actually a very sort of deliberate set of practices. At the Children's Seashore House, 11 a.m. was designated the bathing hour. And when children would take a sea bath, children who were able and ambulatory enough would be directed by a nurse to go to a very specific spot in the ocean and bathe in a certain way. So you can see these youngsters have like hiked up their pants and they're going in with their legs and they're getting wet. For children who were too weak, if they could withstand the sort of power of the water hitting them, there was actually a bather, and a bather would carry them either in a basket, like a big wicker basket, or on a stretcher out into the ocean and like kind of like dunk them up and down for a sort of set number of minutes and then bring them back out. And children who were too weak to withstand any of that would actually take their baths with seawater that was pumped into the hospital itself. Other children would actually be told like to totally submerge and sort of jump up and down a few times. Now, the idea was that bathing in seawater elicited really beneficial reactions. And in 1865, one of the sort of prominent marine medication advocates was a French physician named André Brochard. And he sort of detailed what this was. And he said, the reason that seawater was so beneficial is that it caused a sequence of reactions. And the first one was this. He called it the phenomenon of immersion. And this is his quote. He said that patients would experience, quote, a sensation of cold, often sharp, sometimes even painful, immediately followed by a general spasm. The skin is chilled, it becomes pale, puckered, like the skin of fowls, sometimes blue. The breathing is catching. If the bather tries to speak, his words are ejaculated one by one. A trembling seizes the jaws and limbs, and the pulse becomes small and thready. Now, if you've ever done like a polar plunge or just like gone into the Atlantic Ocean like really early on in the season, it kind of sounds familiar, right? And so that part, not the good part, not the fun part. The beneficial part was what he called the phenomenon of reaction. And he said that's really where the health benefits come in. And what he said was that it was during this period that bathers would experience a sense or expansion and invigoration. It was characterized by a return of warmth, regular breathing, a decrease in heart rate, a full pulse, and rosy skin, right? So it's like, oh, it feels good, right? Now, here was the trick. People would designate certain amounts of time, physicians and nurses would designate certain amounts of time for children to be in the water. They would never go beyond, the Children's Seashore House normally had a 4-minute limit. Later on, one of the hospitals in England who did this had between 30 seconds and 7-minute limit, depending upon the child, because the problem was if you stayed in too long, the second reaction would subside and the third very dangerous reaction would come about. Okay, and if that third reaction came about, it would, this was called the phenomenon of immersion, all sorts of difficulties might arise. This could include coma, syncope, throbbing headaches, apoplexy in the aged, congestion of internal organs, subnormal temperatures, or even death, right? So clearly staying in the ocean too long, as far as physicians were concerned, was an incredibly dangerous proposition. So you had to time it right. And as long as you timed it right and you didn't stay in too long, one of the things that patients would experience is like an increase in metabolism. And this was really important because a lot of the children who would be going to these institutions would be very weak, they would be malnourished. And as malnourished children, they'd be like very skinny. So what you wanted to do is sort of like increase their metabolism and get them to eat more. And certainly that's one of the things that physicians found. One of my favorite stories was a case where a bunch of children were sent from an urban hospital in Philadelphia and sent down to the Children's Seashore House in Atlantic City. And the referring physicians like wrote a letter to the Children's Seashore House and said like, listen, you're gonna have to force these kids to eat. They refuse to eat, they just won't do it. And Bennett writes in his report like, no such action was necessary. As soon as they came, their awakened seashore appetites came about, and soon they were brown and sturdy as whistling country boys, right? And so he had this kind of sense that like, this is one of the benefits that came about. Here's a sort of a sketch of the original Seashore House, and you can sort of see like the little like children sea bathing. It looks very dangerous, I think, in this one, and much less regulated. I think this is really just an artist's rendering. So if children were mostly spending like between 30 seconds and 7 minutes sea bathing, what were they doing the rest of the day? One of the things that they were most commonly doing is just playing on the beach. And rather than it sort of being conceptualized as playing on the beach, although that's exactly what they were doing, they were digging in the sand, as you can see in this picture on the right-hand side. They were flying kites. Sometimes they might be reading a book if they were an older, especially older girls would do that. But this was part of a larger process of sea air bathing. And one of the things that physicians did is they went to great lengths to detail like what made sea air sort of so beneficial to people. And what they did was they started studying the chemical composition of it. And one of the things that they determined was that the sea air contained ozone. And now today we think of ozone as being something dangerous that we should avoid. In the 19th century, ozone was seen as a sort of a purifying force. And what they would do is like physicians would study the differences between ozone levels in the city, especially during the city and during epidemics or pandemics, and they would be like, there's no ozone to be found. And then they would go to the mountains or they would go to the beach, and suddenly they would see that there was ozone aplenty. And so part of their conclusion is like, if you know the city is unhealthy, especially during a time of a sort of epidemic or an outbreak of disease, and yet these other places that did not suffer those same fates had ozone, the conclusion was the ozone itself was actually purifying the air. Additionally, they sort of would point to things like the salinity that was in the air as sort of being beneficial to people who had breathing issues. And because of the sea breeze, right, as the sea breeze was coming in, it was getting rid of anything that might be sort of like bad, and sort of causing any kind of disease in the inhabitants. And you would see physicians being like, it gets rid of both the noxious effluvia, in the sort of term of the 1880s, as well as bacteria. So right, anything possible that was bad, the sea breezes would take care of. They also studied the air density. And so one of the things they found is that the air is more dense at the seashore. This they believed was beneficial because it caused people to sort of breathe more deeply and able to get more air, which actually oxygenated their blood more readily. And again, they sort of tied this to an increase overall in metabolism. Right, so all of these things are sort of working on children, and because you're constantly surrounded by all these sort of like health-giving benefits of the sea air, people sort of saw that as being part of the benefit. The third and final one that I want to touch on tonight is sunbathing. I love this picture. If you can't see it, this is a picture of Dr. Sun. He's carrying his little doctor's bag, and you can see like happy, healthy, vibrant children playing in the background. And there was a lot of rhetoric and a lot of ink spilled about the health benefits of sunlight and sunbathing, especially for children. And they had all sorts of wonderful analogies that were like, drawing comparisons between children and potato plants. And I'd be happy to talk to you about how they were sort of like conceptualizing this. But one of the things that really intrigued me about the sunbathing is that it was a very medicalized process. So this was a chart that was from a book called Heliotherapy that was written by a Swiss physician named Auguste Rollier. And what he contended, and he operated a sanitarium on a Swiss Alp. And what he said was like, one of the things that was really beneficial was getting people to sort of, to become actually very, very tanned. And he said, you have to attenuate the body. So it was a very gradual dosing of the sunlight. So you can see here what would happen is like on day one, he said, like, if you want to do heliotherapy, you have to really gradually expose the body. So day one, a nurse would wheel a patient out onto a sun deck, expose their feet for 5 minutes, cover the feet, wheel the patient back inside. Day two, you would raise up the sheet all the way up to the knee. You would then cover it. That would be exposed for 5 minutes. You'd cover it down to the feet. Feet got another 5 minutes. Then everything was covered. You're wheeled back in, right? So you can see it goes all the way up. You never got to the point of the head. People would always be wearing sort of like sun bonnets and things, or like actually have sunshades to protect their heads while they were sunbathing. But the goal was really to develop a deep, dark tan, because that was believed to be beneficial. And you saw these practices institutionalized at seashore hospitals. So the picture on the left-hand side is the top deck of the Children's Seashore House, right? And you can see these are patients who were wheeled out. And this was actually, if you can see the text underneath, it says a midwinter porch scene. So even in the middle of winter, children are being brought outside to derive the benefits both of the sun as well as the sea air. The pictures in the middle are both taken from Seabreeze Hospital, which was on Coney Island. This was also a hospital for tubercular children. And both of these are showing children who are undergoing heliotherapy. So it looks like they're just like sitting outside in various stages of dress, but this was actually part of their therapeutic process. And the picture on the far right, I think, is especially interesting because you can really see the ways in which different sort of technologies and these ideas kind of collapse. So these children are all in plaster jackets in order to help straighten their spine, but you'll notice that there's a big cutout in the center. And the cutout in the center was to allow for heliotherapy and the sun's rays to actually more deeply penetrate the parts of the bodies that were diseased. And a lot of times children who had tuberculosis, it did not sort of appear mostly in their lungs. It was actually in their bones and in their joints is where the ways in which it would sort of express itself. And these ideas were not simply sort of like kept within seashore hospitals. These were really sort of widely used practices. So the picture on your left-hand side is a picture from Chicago, right? And you can see children who are sunbathing out on a sun porch there. The picture on the right is Sunlight for Babies, and that was distributed by the U.S. Children's Bureau. It was actually like one of their most popular requested pamphlets, and would actually instruct mothers on how to properly sunbathe their babies at home, like what you needed to do, what hours you were looking for, and how to make sure your children were really getting enough sunlight, right? So one of the reasons that I've studied these institutions is not because I love institutional histories per se, I will say I'm very fortunate in that William Bennett is a great writer. He uses wonderful quotes a lot of the time, but because it gives us insight into these popular practices, right? And if you think back to the things that these tourists were doing, right, they actually look really similar to the practices that are going on inside of the hospital setting. Now, obviously, like being in a hospital and being in an institution is very different from like, wandering around and like going to the boardwalk. Although patients at the Children's Seashore House did get to go to the boardwalk, and sometimes they'd even like shut down the steel pier for them. But you sort of see these sort of overlaps between these practices. Now, one of the things that I'm probably most often asked when I give these talks is like, did this work? And the short answer is that physicians at the time would have unequivocally said yes, like it absolutely did. And the way they would sort of stake these claims is that they would point to the sort of literally physically reformed bodies of the children who went there. And this little boy who you see on the left-hand side of your screen is a boy named Smiling Joe. His name is Joe Marin, and he had really, really severe tuberculosis of his spine. And he was admitted to Seabreeze Hospital in Coney Island. And newspaper articles would talk about how when he arrived at the hospital, quote, his back was twisted by bone tuberculosis. And he was so bent, the tubercular glands in his back were, quote, so bad he could scarcely crawl. And he was in danger of being bent over almost double, right? So this idea, it was really sort of transforming his bodies in this way that was going to make it such that he was not going to be able to walk. So he arrives at Seabreeze Hospital, and he's kind of known for the smile, and he becomes the poster boy for the institution. And he was so well known that there was actually a story that circulated about a time when President Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt, actually went to Seabreeze to visit the hospital, and he's touring around, and he walks, and he comes up to Joe's bed, and the physician says, "This is little Joe Marin. He's suffering from tuberculosis of the spine, but we expect to cure him." "Poor little fellow," said the president, and his eyes welled up in tears. True to form, Joe broke out into a smile, and the doctor sort of chuckled and said, "That's Joe, he just always smiles." So he becomes this sort of, this poster boy who ends up raising funds. Now, Joe gets sort of taken up by newspapers, reported on. He eventually does go home, but it takes 4 years. So he's in this hospital for 4 years before he actually ends up going home. And I see, and for Bones for TV, given vitamin D from sunlight. So it's not actually the vitamin D from the sunlight that was working. That was absolutely for rickets. The sunlight was actually because they believed it worked because it was bactericidal. So this idea that it could actually penetrate into the wounds, and a lot of times children who suffered from tuberculosis actually had big open weeping wounds, and they were called sinuses, and those sinuses were like just notoriously difficult to treat. Like physicians in cities would come up with like these pastes that they would rub in there and like have to extract. They just couldn't get them to close. And suddenly they would send these patients down to the seashore hospitals, and they would seem to be miraculously closed. Like it really kind of boggled the mind. And yes, Mira, you're absolutely right. Heliotherapy did help kids with rickets. It absolutely did. And it was one of the things that they talked about. And yes, because the children were there for so long, they did. So for, there were some patients who just went for like a week or two over the summer. Those were also ones who would stay with their mothers. They actually had little mothers' cottages, so mothers could bring their families and their children down with them. But for children like Joe, who had to stay for years, they did provide schooling. They actually hired a special teacher for them. So what happened to these institutions? Right, I mentioned that today you can walk down like West Philly, a street in West Philly, and see the Children's Seashore House. You can be in Chinatown in Boston and see the Boston Floating Hospital. So they're around, but they're obviously not looking like the same institutions that they were in the late 19th and early 20th century. And yet, if they were so successful, like why aren't they around in their same incarnations? And I think there's a couple of things. There's a really, really not a wonderful like story of declension, right? There was never a time when all of a sudden the medical rationale suddenly shifted and people said like, this is crazy, why are we doing this? they just kind of slowly faded away for a couple of reasons. One of them is that there were sort of new technologies. One of the technologies of milk pasteurization actually really reduced the rates of tuberculosis in children, because one of the ways it was believed children were getting tuberculosis was from milk from cows. So it was bovine tuberculosis that was infecting them. Pasteurization took care of that. So you actually, and you also saw increased sanitation, increased access to more and better food in cities. So overall standards of life were improving and rates of tuberculosis were declining. You also had the invention of different technologies that were supplanting the sort of nature-based practices. So these are UV lamps, and UV lamps were very much derivative of people's belief in the benefits of sun therapy. So, right, so here you see 5 little toddlers in a pen in a hospital receiving UV therapy all at one time. And Audrey, to your question about who was paying for the Children's Seashore House, that's another reason that these ended up sort of faltering. These were entirely philanthropic. They were completely dependent upon donations. Because they were oftentimes a tourist attraction, they would actually get a lot of money from the tourists who would come. They also had benefactors from the city. And so they would raise a lot of money that way. But as you sort of enter into the 1920s and eventually get the stock market crash, those revenues and those funds dry up. Right, you're also moving out of what, you know, so we as historians call like the progressive period, where you had a lot of sort of like philanthropic investment in things like medical care, right? So there's a lot of sort of shifting things that are occurring. One of the other things that I think is also happening is that tourists very quickly take over a lot of the medical practices. It becomes almost hard to see and look at people who are like out in the ocean and sitting on the sand as really partaking in a medical practice. And even things like I mentioned, the bathhouse was very quickly taken over by like sort of as a popular tourist spot. I think that in Atlantic City, one of the things they were known for were these wicker rolling chairs, right? And it was considered a highly fashionable way to move about the boardwalk. They were pushed by a porter who was most oftentimes a Black man. And that is how you would move about in style. Originally, these were wheelchairs, right? These were meant for rental by people who could not physically walk themselves down the boardwalk. They would be attended to by a nurse. But again, in sort of similar fashion to what happened with the bathhouse, right? They became popular, right? So I think you always are seeing this kind of blend of sort of pleasure with health until it becomes almost so hard to see. So there was also a question about what the relationship is between minorities and the seashore hospitals. Were they accessible to them even when they were more localized in urban areas? So that's a really interesting question, not least because what ends up happening is that the Children's Seashore House is actually in Atlantic City until 1990. So it was always open to minority. It was always interracial from its foundation and all the way through. Again, it wasn't in equal proportions, and I haven't really looked at like what the sort of race breakdown was more specifically, but they were. So, and then yes, being, sort of moving up to Philadelphia in 1990, the idea was really that they could better serve Philadelphia youth by being located in Philadelphia. And by that point, it had become more of a rehab hospital. So then, sort of like what happens, how does that sort of relate to today, right? But this is an article that I love. I actually have my students read this article. It's from 1939. And it's talking about prescribing vacations. And one of the things that you see happening even in the 19th century is that physicians are like, patients, you should go and do this. And then they get really frustrated because patients just start sort of doing it on their own. And they're like, no, you don't understand. Like, you have to be really careful. Like this is like medicine. And patients go there and they're like, kind of, right? And then they do whatever they please. And doctors become really frustrated that people aren't being more careful. And by the time you get to the mid 20th century, when this article was produced, you have people who are trying to convince the public that you need to actually be thoughtful about where you go on vacation, because some people, it might be really good for us to go to the beach. And maybe for other people, that's not where they need to go. And, people at various times and physicians at various times would have said, okay, if you have pulmonary tuberculosis, you should be going to a mountain. You should not be going to the seashore. Seashore exacerbates it because of the salinity. So they were actually sort of still demarcating different spots for different people, but nobody was really listening anymore. So where does that leave us today? What is the legacy? I hope that one of the things that we can sort of talk about and take away is like, what are those sort of the ways in which this is still resonant? And one of the things that always has really struck me is that we still think about the beach as being a really appropriate and beneficial place to go on vacation as a family, right? And this was a picture from Harper's around the turn of the 20th century, right? And you see these like ladies dressed, these mothers dressed in their like dresses, and they're surrounded by children. And if you can see the little girl with the bonnet standing, as well as the children laying down, they're digging in the sand. They have their sand buckets. It looks strikingly similar to the picture on the top, right? If you look at some of the other pictures from the sort of turn of the 20th century, you see children running and jumping into the ocean waves, right? All of these things, I think, sort of speak to the longevity of this association between American families and the seashore, and it is being a place that's sort of intrinsically beneficial for children to go. And one of the things I sort of delight in is that we're also returning to, although it's different, this idea that maybe what we should be doing is prescribing time outside. And there is this really fascinating movement across the United States where doctors are trying to start to prescribe time outside, especially for children, right? And the top you see NatureRx. This was a program with Cornell, and it says time in nature equals a healthier you. Right? People are doing things like forest bathing. They're going to the ocean. This idea that like what we need to be doing is sort of like reconnecting with the natural world. And especially right now in the midst of this pandemic, the ways in which we're sort of turning to the outdoors as being the sort of safe, if not outwardly beneficial place for us to be, I think has like a really new resonance to it. So I hope that some of these sort of conversations spark some interest and more questions. Like I said, I'd be happy to answer any questions you have. And I will just end by saying, like, I am all for a nature prescription. I would certainly take a nature prescription to the beach right now. And I really appreciate you spending your evening with me. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Maggie. So yeah, we'll take questions through chat. And I think Maggie did such a great job of keeping up with the questions that came up during it. I don't think there were any that I saw that weren't answered. There's a lot of thank yous coming through. I have a question I'll just throw out. Like when you were talking about tanning or the goal of tanning, but the sun, I mean, wasn't it true in the 19th century that people tried to stay out of the sun, especially the upper classes?
Yeah, so that's one of the really fascinating things about this story is that you're right, like sort of up to about the late 19th century, being tan was very much a sort of a sign of being working class, right? It meant you were outdoors, toiling in the field. And so a standard of beauty for especially women was to have a very pale visage. It's where you got sort of like powders for, women's powders and things like that. Once tourism and sort of beach tourism became popular, you actually saw that starting to shift. So what then became fashionable was a very tan face. And I think it's actually something we're still left with today, even though we sort of know that tanning's not good for us, right? You still see people like, oh, you can get a healthy tan. Or like, oh, you look so good. Were you at the beach? Like, were you outside? Right? We still have this kind of association. So this is actually one of those ways that you're sort of seeing that shift actually occur, is sort of with these trends towards outdoor tourism and getting out of the city.
Yeah, it's interesting. So I'm just gonna get back to the questions because a few came in. Oh, were there seashore hospitals for adults?
There were, yes, there were. They were not as popular. So there was one for women that was run by the same physician, William Bennett, also in Atlantic City. And it was really this idea of sort of like getting like girls who are working in industry and like sort of like giving them a break. But really, it was really meant for children primarily. So even like France and Brex-sur-Mer, there were some in Sweden, and they were almost always focused and localized on children. I think with the idea that because children's bodies were developing, they were sort of almost like uniquely vulnerable to like the sort of ills of city life, but also uniquely benefited from a change in their environment because they were still growing. There was like more ability to sort of shift their bodies and shift their health.
Another question is, you mentioned earlier that there was concern of mothers with experimentation being carried out in the urban hospitals. Do you think seashore hospitals were a way for the mothers to feel more secure?
I absolutely do. And I think a large part of that was the fact that mothers were from the beginning invited into the institutions, and that was actually part of the infrastructure. So even in the first hospital, there was like the main hospital building, which is where children who were admitted without their mothers would stay. But the mothers' cottages would extend in kind of parallel lines all the way to the oceanfront. And it was a way, and one of the things I found is that like mothers were actually going like with their sisters, with their neighbors. It almost became like a vacation spot. And they could all go there, and it had this sort of like safe and closed space where like they could watch over their children as their children were playing on the beach. They weren't in the city. They would take their meals all together in a dining hall. So you kind of had to deal with like nurses overseeing you and telling you to clean up your cottage, but you had a lot of assistance. And I think the fact that mothers were always welcome there, and mothers could also go and visit their children, I think it gave them a sense that this was a place where their children were going to be safe and taken care of. And I think there were also these large, if informal, networks of mothers who were sort of like talking to each other and recommending it. So it was kind of like there was a lot of eyes on the institution. So I do think that they felt safer there.
Somebody asked a question sort of going back to this timeline of the 19th century and when things changed. They're curious about the timeline since Jane Austen's books, Emma, Persuasion, emphasized the healthfulness of sea air, and that was before 1815. So was it just this idea lasted a long time?
Yeah, so it was, it's a little earlier actually in Britain than it was in the US. And it's funny because when I've done this sort of like a similar presentation for international audience, whenever I have do this with, you know, especially like British audience, they're like, well, of course, it's like nothing I've said is interesting because they're like, it's just so taken for granted. But it was actually the sort of British aristocracy that sort of first brought a lot of these practices into sort of like a more popular, you know, vision. And really, because for a long time, the sea was dangerous. Like people did not go, like the only people who went to the ocean were like if you worked there because you were a fisherman or you were an explorer, right? But it was, they knew it was dangerous. So it was not seen as a place of sort of leisure. And it was only once sort of like royal families and aristocrats started going there that it became more popular. And a lot of it sort of like was this idea, right? Because in this time period, the ideas about what caused ill health was largely miasmatic. So this idea that like rotting effluvia and like material is what's going to make you sick and enter your bodies. And it was rotting like sort of biological material. So if you think about like what cities looked like then, you have people throwing their slop from their kitchen out into the streets. It's also where your excrement is, dead like horses, horse manure, right? Like it's, they're smelly, right? And they're dirty. And so this idea of like, if that's what's making you sick, obviously if you go to a place that's sort of free of all of that, is going to be more beneficial. So it is a much sort of longer standing idea, but it's also one I think that's based really much in ideas about like what is causing ill health and what is therefore sort of healthy. But yes, fresh air always sort of seen as being like something that was beneficial.
Yeah, and one person made a comment, leaving cities for health was not new.
No,
and yellow fever, you know, epidemics driving.
Well, and yeah, and even way before that, right? Like this was always, especially in times of epidemics, or right, that's the first thing people did. Like people fled the city. Like they knew like that was the thing to do. So whether or not that was the bubonic plague in the 1300s or 1600s, or if it is the COVID pandemic, right? If you can escape the city, you escape the city. right? And it is one of those like really long, interesting trajectories. So even when we have different conceptualizations of like what is actually making us sick, it still is a really, really common solution. So yeah, so it was escaping miasma at one point. And today it was, sort of what you can think about what was happening in New York City, where people are like, oh my God, everybody's fleeing to their like country homes to like get out of the city right now, right? There is still that sort of association of like being in a densely packed urban environment is not beneficial in terms of transmission, even if ideas of transmission changed.
One person who said, that's awesome. When does your book come out?
Oh, thank you. I don't have a date yet, but I will certainly, Susan, if it's okay, I will let you know.
Oh, absolutely. We'll
yeah,
share that. That's
Yeah,
great.
and
That's good.
it is in the final stages, but I'm still reviewing, like sort of reworking that final revision. So hopefully in about a year, the wheels of the Academy turn more slowly.
Well, you've got a small initial audience just from this talk, I think. So
Wonderful.
that's great. Oh, one person said, thank you. Your talk brought back memories that she worked at, she said, I worked there one summer. I think she meant, I'm not sure which place, but maybe the Seaside Hospital.
Yeah, I mean, it was there, and there's actually like these wonderful and beautiful like tributes, like when they were just closing. And one of my colleagues and advisors also was a nurse at the Children's Seashore House when it was still in Atlantic City. And she sort of recalled as I was working on this, she's like, we used to take the kids out to the beach and like let them go swimming. And it was like part of their therapy. And she was like, we would stand there and be like, we don't really know why we're doing this, but they seem really happy, so why not, right? So they still had some of these practices like built into the daily routine that didn't make sense, like in sort of the late 20th century, very biomedical sort of mindset. But everyone's like, like it works. Kids are happy, like let's let them do it. So I'm glad. It did. Sorry. Oh, I saw that. When did the Children's Seashore House move to Philly? 1990. And I understand it might be closing soon, which would be absolutely heartbreaking to me. I don't know what they're doing. They're doing a lot of expansion over there right now. I do know if you want to go there once the world opens up again, they have a sea garden on their top roof where they will bring patients outside to be able to experience like outdoor air. And they actually pipe in the sounds of ocean waves.
Wow.
So they were trying to, I think, embrace their history. I don't know how much it accomplishes it, like being over there. It's a very busy area. So, but at least it's a space that is still outside.
Wow. I think that's it. A lot of thank yous. And
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you from us. Any other questions? Well, thanks so much, Maggie. This was great. I think it was a very helpful program to have right now. Since we're all back in lockdown and at least contemplating going back to the beach next summer is kind of a happy thought. So thanks for a wonderful program. We hope to see you at the Wagner in the future when we're open again. So take care. Have a good night.